The Walmart DTW case can't be bought aftermarket as a standalone case, but we're going to test it as if it could be. So what we're doing is isolating the variables of the Walmart DTW systems to look at the quality of each different component. And this case only comes with the DTW1, 2, and 3, but we've put our standardized test bench in it for case reviews, and that's what we're going to be working with today, treating this as if it were any other case that we could review from the aftermarket part selection. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the Gamers Nexus store. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up one of our ceramic mugs, critically acclaimed mod mats, or educational video card teardown and PCB anatomy posters that teach the names and placements of all the key PCB components. Learn more at store.gamersnexus.net or click the link below. So a couple things to keep in mind here. Clearly, because you can't buy this as a standalone case, this is really an extra, and it's an academic exercise. We're seeing how good the case is. If it were able to be tested like a normal case, which, I mean, you can do it, everything fits, and it's just an adapted version of some supplier case. I mean, it seems that they bought it from Great Wall. Great Wall makes cases kind of like Jonesbow. So if you're not familiar with Jonesbow, you might know the company Rosewell. It's basically the store brand of Newegg, and Rosewell has a case called the Coleman, and so does Anades, the AI crystal. It's the same case. It comes from Jonesbow. Then those two companies put their sticker on it, much like Walmart has done here. Although Walmart's done some light customization that we'll talk about in Patrick's build notes, like primarily this front panel, which has been replaced from what is clearly, it used to be a plastic panel because there's holes in there for the plastic alligator clips. Those have been removed and instead replaced with a glass panel that's screwed in from the inside. So there's some light customization there, but otherwise, this is a supplier case that any of the companies on the market could likely purchase and then rebrand if they wanted to, just like a lot of the other low-end cases. And this case in particular, it's kind of similar to some stuff we've seen in the past. So it's got 3 fan mounts in the front. They're 140 capable, but they're 120 in the builds that Walmart assembles. If you wanted to, for some reason, you could buy one and upgrade it, though that's probably inadvisable because at that point you might as well just build your own. But the case otherwise, pretty standard layout. So it's got a power supply shroud. There's some holes in the power supply shroud. No particular reason, but they're there right above the hard drive cage. So you can see into the cage when you get the system, see what hard drive it is. Underneath the hard drive cage, there is actually some ventilation for the drives, which is, there's no real clear point to why that's there, which we'll talk about that later because it ends up serving more as an exhaust because this is a positive pressure system with 3 fans intake, 1 fan exhaust. So you end up with positive pressure. The top has no ventilation. It's a flat top and no radiator support in the top either, which given the circumstances is fine. The front, you could fit a radiator in there, but probably about a 240 max. Not sure about a 280. We didn't try a 280. The front panel distance, the glass to case distance is about 4 millimeters or thereabouts. So it's about the smallest distance we've seen for a breathable front panel, although the BitPhoenix Enso competes both thermally and in design choice for the front panel. The back side of the case is also pretty standard. So for this, there's a couple Ssd mounts. So you've got 2 mounts here. There's an optional mount in this area, actually 2 of those optional mounts here, except the Walmart case has covered those optional 2.5 mounts with these cable routing devices, I guess. Cable combs, basically. So plastic cable clips, which actually work out pretty nicely with the stock Walmart build. They do tie the cables down more than you might expect. So that is not something we always see from the lower end, cheaper OEMs where they actually will manage the backside of the case. Walmart, to their credit, did it, and that's something we gave them credit for in the original thing. But anyway, that's the backside of the case from the DIY approach. You've got a couple 2.5-inch drive mounts. There's hard drive mounts down there. That's also where Walmart installed that 2.5-inch drive. When they shipped the system, standard power supply support, you couldn't fit something too deep though, because you run into the hard drive cages pretty soon after extending past the ARM650X distance. That's more or less the case though as an overview. So let's go through Patrick's build notes and through my thermal notes, and you'll have a full picture of how this case performs as a standalone case if you could buy one for DIY purposes. The Walmart DTW case is clearly not a case that was created specifically for Walmart. If it was, it wouldn't have 3 unused 2.5-inch mounts, an unused 5.25-inch mount, holes for 140mm intake fans, or an LED control cable labeled reset switch that's been rerouted to an added-on LED box. It also wouldn't have a clearly bolted-on glass panel in the front, which obstructs the 5.25-inch bay that you shouldn't be using anyway. This is a generic enclosure from an existing supplier with some light customization to fit Walmart's needs. And given the shipping box it came in, it's likely that the case ships out of Great Wall. Great Wall is a supplier in the PSU and case space to some extent, though it's best known for its Corsair CX PSUs. The upside of this repurposing of the chassis is that the case is more versatile than otherwise necessary. We were able to install our normal ATX test system without any clearance problems, for example, fitting the full cooler at about 140-150 millimeters height from the board. It's possible to swap different fans, drives, and other components into the case, which isn't something to take for granted in a pre-built system. The stock motherboard is micro ATX, so even the fact that the case can fit normal ATX boards is an unintended bonus here. And just to be clear, it's not uncommon for a base chassis to be reused and modified by even larger name manufacturers or store brands like Rosewell, who buy from Jonesbow to make the Coleman, for example. The front of the chassis has holes drilled into it to fit round clips commonly used on plastic front panels, which is what this chassis was originally designed for, but the front panel in this enclosure is a pane of tempered glass that's been jury-rigged to the front. The supplier does deserve credit for securely mounting a glass panel without any visible screws from the outside, especially on a chassis that was built for plastic originally, but the method of attachment makes taking the front panel off inconvenient. Both side panels must be removed to reach the 4 case screws that hold on the front panel. This flaw is, fortunately or not, canceled out by another one. Since there's no front filter at all, there's no need to take off the front panel to get to it, because it's not there. The target audience for these pre-built systems isn't interested in building their own computers, so they're probably not interested in taking them apart and dusting it every few months either. Unfortunately, this is also one of the easiest ways to protect a system from an early death, as dust is one of the most common killers of a non-enthusiast desktop PC, or even an enthusiast PC. The only filters in the case are along the bottom. There's a reasonable filter for the power supply and a completely unnecessary one for the hard drive cage. It's unclear what the purpose of the ventilation is underneath the hard drive cage and why there's a filter there, since the case has positive pressure, 3 fans in the front intake, 1 in the back for exhaust. It functions only to exhaust air that hasn't yet had a chance to reach any of the hot components internally, which would be a tremendous oversight if done by any respectable case manufacturer. Everything except the glass panels is constructed from steel, typical of inexpensive cases. There are some small stamped reinforcements on the bottom and the shroud, and the only part of the case that's overtly flimsy is the metal side panel. The problem is that this side panel can't hook into the case along the whole bottom edge because a gap is left in the chassis to fit the power supply, so the bottom corner is free to flex outwards if it isn't screwed down. The PCIe slot covers are also of the single-use variety, and they're stamped out of the case material and have to be pried out with a screwdriver, which is a cost-cutting measure we almost never see in individually sold cases these days. Capacity for cable management is surprisingly decent, although the system still came with power cables zip-tied to the 2.5-inch bays. There are plastic cable channels at the front of the case and a slightly widened section that contains more unused 2.5-inch mounts, and there are cable tie points all around the edges. Speaking of unused 2.5-inch mounts, we counted 5, and yet the SSD that shipped with the system was installed in one of the 3.5-inch bays. And at 5, it's about a 3+2 configuration depending on how you add them up. As we noted earlier, the fan hub used in the DTW1 is almost identical to the one that Lian Li has used in the past. One key difference is that the Lian Li controller has a PWM input to control fan speeds via the motherboard, while the Walmart variant uses the cable for manual LED control instead. That means there's no way to control case fan speeds at all. The fan connectors are non-standard, so they cannot be directly connected to the motherboard to bypass the hub. It's unclear what speed the case fans run at or whether they're being run at their maximum capacity. There's no labeling on the fans, so we don't even know their specs. The fans also don't have any kind of diffusing layer over their LEDs like Lian Li's Boras do, so the lighting effect is a scattering of bright points rather than a smooth rain. But at least that's clearly shown on the product page. The front I/O is unremarkable overall, other than 3 USB 2.0 ports. The DTW1's motherboard does indeed have a USB 3.0 header, but that's for the full system and we're reviewing the case today. Either way though, if you missed it, that header is connected to a USB Type-C expansion card at the rear of the case, which is why you don't see any 3.0 at the front I/O section of the case. Getting into the thermal section, this one's pretty straightforward. We're just testing it stock, and then we're testing it again without the front panel at all, removing the glass panel and still using all the stock fans. For CPU torture testing, the Walmart case with our standardized test bench immediately positions itself at the bottom of the stack, alongside the Inwin 805 Infinity and Inwin 303, which has no fans. The difference here is that the Walmart case has 4 included fans, all of which are thoroughly suffocated by the front panel, that glass panel that's screwed in. What isn't shown by this chart is that the CPU thermal result of 73.4 degrees over ambient is actually after thermal throttling. In reality, we're in the 90s, and that's after clock drops from bouncing off of TJ Maxx on the CPU. The case failed this test midway and had to be shut down as it was exceeding safe thermal ranges. And just to really illustrate the point, removing the front panel instantly drops our operating temperature to 45 degrees over ambient on the CPU, a reduction of nearly 30 degrees. This is the most egregious instance of a suffocating front panel we've yet seen, and blows away the differences we saw in the original H500P last year. We've never seen a case with airflow this choked off by paneling. By removing the panel, the case ranks alongside some of the best cooled cases we've worked with, which isn't saying anything other than that 4 fans and no front panel really does pretty well. That's because the brute force cooling offered by those 4 fans without an obstructing panel is naturally going to cool things down a bit. Even the idle temperatures are high in the unmodified tests of the Walmart case, which in itself is a tremendous feat. It's an accomplishment, really, to run idle temperatures as high as this case is. Here's a chart showing thermal throttling on the CPU clock, where we occasionally drop down to 3500 MHz from 4400 MHz. Now, keep in mind that this case is bundled with an 8700, and it's not something you can buy standalone anyway. Also, the 8700 isn't overclocked in any way, because it can't be. So it's not as dire for the stock use case when you would buy this system, but it's also objectively a hot case. GPU thermals are where we really start to realize those losses from the high temperatures. If you've never seen why running so hot is problematic, aside from increasing noise levels and diminishing product longevity on things like 85C capacitors, we can show that there's actually performance loss too after this chart. Our test GPU is a GTX 1080 Gaming X for all of these test cases, and that runs at 62 degrees over ambient in the full stock configuration. This isn't the worst GPU temperature we've seen, but the card is throttling a bit. We'll show that momentarily. The stock results plant this one right around where the Bitphoenix Enso lands, which was one of the more constrained cases, to say the least, that we reviewed last year. Coincidentally, it also had a completely obstructed front panel on that Bitphoenix Enso. Removing the panel gets the Walmart thermals down to 49.9 degrees over ambient. Again, that's using our standardized test bench, not the native computer that came in it. This plants it at around result 42 on our table of over 160 results for case thermals. In this heavily truncated chart, though, for space, we ended up near the Roswell Cullinan, which is actually a pretty good case overall. As for those throttling charts, here they are. The stock Walmart case drops about 100 MHz off of the GPU clock with the front panel installed, whereas the panelless Walmart case is tied in frequency with the chart-topping half X. That impact will manifest itself in frame rate when the panel is present, and one of the Walmart SKUs does indeed include a hotter card than the one we're testing here today. That's the GTX 1080 Ti, and we'll hopefully test that soon. For a less abusive test, we turn to 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme as a stand-in for a gaming workload. This one positions the GPU as among the worst results in our thermal testing for cases, right next to the poorly performing Bitphoenix Enso and Antec P8, both of which were lambasted appropriately. More importantly, look closely at the CPU results and you'll see that the Walmart case is the only one which breaks 40 degrees over ambient. This is a GPU intensive load. So to see this sort of thermal results for the CPU indicates difficulty exhausting hot air from the case. For a CPU-only workload, we turn next to Blender, rendering within the Walmart PC case. This one positions the Walmart DTW case at 49 degrees over ambient for CPU temperature, marking it as the single worst case in all of the results, and by a fairly wide margin. The next worst is the Corsair Spec 04, a $40 case that comes with one fan and which Newegg recently struggled to even give away. For Blender GPU thermals, the Walmart case ends up at 32 degrees over ambient, which is around the Bitphoenix Enso once again. It seems the Walmart case possesses similar GPU thermal characteristics to the Enso, whereas the CPU does far worse by comparison. CPU thermals remain the highest of any Blender result yet, even though the CPU isn't even being loaded here. It's not doing anything. That's just the CPU pulling in all of the hot exhaust from the GPU and then struggling to dissipate it because of the air path. Noise levels in the Walmart DTW case aren't the worst we've seen, but they are the worst we've seen when considering the ratio to thermal performance. For the decibel, the DTW is the worst we've tested, and that includes a case in our thermal charts that doesn't even have a fan in it. The DTW ends up at 39.7 dBA, putting it alongside the NZXT H500, a case which is thermally superior in all tests. So that's the case. It's about the worst thermally performing case we've tested, just like the H500P non-mesh. The original H500P, the big thing to look at is the delta with the panel versus without the panel. And in this case, we're seeing like 30-degree differences on the CPU, which is massive. That's crazy. You should never have a delta that big because that just shows how much the front panel is limiting the cable. This system actually does kind of okay when you remove that glass panel, which is the same story we've been telling with a lot of the aftermarket cases, but this one just really exaggerates the problem because how little depth there is for those fans to exercise their ability to bring air in. There's just not enough static pressure performance when you're fighting a wall of glass with 4 millimeters between the fan and the glass. So thermally, not so good. You remove the panel, it's actually pretty okay. It does fine. It's in the middle, top half of the pack, somewhere in there, depending on which chart you're looking at. So I guess the bigger problem with this is if you ignore it as a standalone product for a second, you look back at the full system assembly, if you're buying the after tax, where we are anyway, $2,252 system, and you get this case with it, kind of a ripoff, because this is functionally a $60 case. If you could buy it retail, that's about where it would stand, and it's not good. So not a good combination for a $2,000+ system. It has to be a little bit more airflow there, especially because they're running a 1080 Ti in that system. We only have a 1080 in our test bench for cases. 1080 Ti is going to generate more heat, and that's a problem for something that's thermally constrained. But as a standalone case, this is the kind of thing where we'd say, like, thermal is pretty bad, but if you could replace the front panel, it might be okay as a $50 ultra budget case. It's not the worst thing we've ever worked with internally. Cable management's actually fine. It's not bad at all. Cutouts could be in better places on the motherboard side, but on the back side, there's enough depth to work with. And I mean, all this stuff is where it should be. I don't know how much more credit I can really give them. So yeah, thermally it's awful, terrible, worst performer we've ever worked with in an impressive way. But otherwise, it's not horribly offensive, I guess. Maybe a better front panel would do the case a lot of good, because if Walmart could replace the front panel, now their systems, depending on which one it is, the 1070, 8700 SKU, it's not overheating really in a massive way, but you start pushing 1080 Ti in there, and it is going to drop clocks a little bit. So that's it for this one, though. Kind of fun to look at as a standalone product, just to see what would happen if you could buy this thing standalone, and maybe you can, or will be able to at some point, because it's just a supplier-made case, and that'll eventually hit the channel. So subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, helps out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat or one of our shirts. And keep an eye out for more coverage of the system, because we have some power supply testing coming up for the 500-watt Great Wall power supply as well. I'll see you all next time.